And I don't quite understand the connection with the trade deficit, but I'm sure we'll get to that. No. No. Okay, Rob, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you to WITA and my good and old friend Ken Levinson for inviting me. Do trade deficits matter? Well, that's easy. It's an easy question for an economist. The answer is yes and no. What's harder is the precise ways, extent, and conditions under which trade deficits do or do not matter. And let me dispose of two of Peter's non sequiturs. First of all, trade deficit is not about poor people and whether we provide health care for them. And let me also say that we've had about 20 financial crises since 1975. So yes, we have a rich data set to understand how advanced economies respond to financial crises. To defend Larry, who was an old classmate of mine. A trade deficit or surplus is a symptom. And here, as in medicine, we should focus on the underlying causes. For example, a trade deficit can be a symptom of quite positive developments. When accelerating growth drives consumers and businesses to pull in more imports. Similarly, a trade deficit allows us, as Carolyn noted, to consume more than we produce, including more investment goods. And when that happens with full employment, strong productivity, and a good investment environment, a rising trade imbalance would present virtually no downside. In fact, that was my regular narrative when I used to announce the monthly trade figures, which is to say the monthly trade deficit figures in the late 1990s in the midst of the longest boom in American history when I was Undersecretary of Commerce. Under other conditions, of course, a rising trade deficit signals negative developments. A growing trade deficit in particular areas may signal that companies in that industry are falling behind their foreign counterparts. More commonly, the negative effects of a trade deficit arise from its financing by international capital flows. We have to pay for our imports, and when we import more than we export, we have to pay the net difference by selling dollars to purchase the currencies of the foreign producers, because that's the currency they want to receive payment in. That leaves foreign companies with dollars they can only spend here, so they use them to buy U.S. stocks, companies, real estate, and other financial assets. The negative here is that those foreign investors take home the dividends, interest, and capital gains they earn from their investments here. More immediately, however, those foreign purchases of American assets also increase our supply of capital, which in turn tends to lower our interest rates. As an accounting matter, the trade deficit is a negative for growth. As an economic matter, the capital flows that finance it stimulate demand and jobs, especially when our saving rate is low. Certainly it would be better if U.S. savings financed those additional investments, but we would be worse off if those investments by foreigners didn't happen at all because, for example, an untutored president slapped tariffs on goods from places that run trade surpluses with us. To be sure, public discussion of the trade deficit usually focuses on jobs, not on growth and investment. Trade certainly costs some jobs, especially jobs between economically disparate countries. That is, trade deficits between advanced economies like ours and developing economies like China's, as opposed to trade deficits or surpluses between the United States and other advanced countries. Jobs are lost at companies that are least competitive with foreign producers, usually in industries that can operate in other countries at significantly less cost than our companies in that industry. That's why it happens in trade between disparate types of economies. That's what offshoring is all about, and when Trump and his allies denounce trade deficits, we should remember that more than half of U.S. imports are what are called related party imports. That's when a company here imports parts or goods from its own foreign subsidiary. It's a transfer within the company. That's half of our imports. It's also 30% of our exports. Involve transfers in the other direction between U.S. and foreign parent companies here and their overseas subsidiaries. Trade also creates jobs in U.S. industries that operate here at less cost or higher quality than elsewhere. So trade moves jobs here as well as investment from industries that are not cost competitive, such as the manufacture of basic commodities, to those where we are cost competitive, like advanced manufacturing and many services. Inevitably, these developments cost some Americans their jobs, and we should help them with much greater access to the means to retrain and, if necessary, relocate. We can do that without undermining our strength as the world's most open economy. Now let's briefly consider how many manufacturing jobs have been lost to the scale of manufacturing jobs lost to global trade. One famous study found that our trade imbalance with China from 1991 to 2011 cost 2 million jobs, including 1 million in manufacturing. Today, 12.4 million Americans are employed in manufacturing. That's 10% of all private employees. So add another million and the percentage rises to 10.8%, from 10% to 10.8. Now compare that to the 1960s, when 25% of employees worked in manufacturing, or the 70s, when they made up 20% of workers. This signals that trade deficits have had very little to do with most of the decline in U.S. manufacturing jobs, since manufacturing's large decline in its share of employment in the 1960s and early 70s happened while we were running trade surpluses, not trade deficits. Similarly, there's no direct relationship between trade deficits and people's incomes or living standards. From 1965 to 2000, manufacturing share of GDP fell from 25% to 15%. It's now about 12%. While real per capita income nearly doubled, from 22,800 to 43,900. Rising living standards depend on rising productivity, which in turn depends on innovation, workers' skills, and capital investment. Trade deficits have no adverse effect on these dynamics. In fact, trade generally promotes higher productivity and living standards in at least 3 ways. First, it shifts capital and jobs from less productive to more productive uses. Second, it provides access to the best ideas developed abroad, which we can use and sometimes improve on. You know, the iPhone that Peter held up is an example of an industry where the U.S. is now a world leader. Well, we didn't invent the cell phone, the commercial cell phone. The Finns did. And we took their ideas and we improved them. That's because we have an open global economy. And lastly, trade puts competitive pressures on U.S. companies to innovate and become more efficient. I want to close for a minute by thinking about trade deficits in a more general way. And this will repeat some of what Carolyn said, but economists have always got to say it 4 or 5 times before they're able to listen. In the broadest sense, the trade deficit is determined by how much we consume versus how much we produce, when how much we consume is determined by how much we save. So a country's trade deficit arises from that country's own saving, investment, and consumption behavior, and not from the subsidy or tariff policies or currency policies of other countries. Those policies do affect how our trade deficit is distributed across both countries and industries, especially policies that involve currencies and exchange rates. Since countries trade in both their own and everyone else's currencies, policies that affect the relative value of those currencies, that is their exchange rates, matter. It's sometimes said that our trade deficit reflects in large part China's program to keep its currency undervalued relative to the dollar. China's program may well affect the U.S.-China bilateral trade deficit, but China's currency policies have little, if any, impact on the saving, investment, and consumption behavior of Americans, and that's what determines our trade deficit. In any case, we saw that 2 decades of currency manipulation by China had only a marginal effect, even on the share of manufacturing jobs in our economy. In the end, my best counsel is to remember one thing. Trade is not an adversarial phenomenon. It involves voluntary exchanges. No one forces anyone to trade with anyone. People trade, and it only occurs when both sides benefit. So let it happen.